What's going on, Dragons? Happy Friday, and welcome to episode 8 of the ERCast, your weekly Friday Night Magic Commander pre-show. I'm your co-host, Cory, and with me this week, you may remember him and love him from past episodes. We brought back my good friend, Cole. Cole, how's it going?
Hey guys, how's it going? I'm doing really good. How are you, Corey?
Solid, you guys can't see it because we're on audio, but Cole got a little glimpse of my pre-official Florida summer shave job. So that's my week so far is losing about 5 pounds of facial hair.
It's clean. It's clean, I have to say.
When you work outside and it's 95 degrees, you take what you can get as far as shedding for the summer, I guess.
Absolutely. Well, hey, I just wanted to say, thank you so much for having me back on, and I'm, excited to kick it out of the park.
Yeah, of course. We're always glad to have you on. So this week, you guys, we are going to be sitting down. Cole is a great person for this topic, by the way, because we're going to be talking about power versus fun when it comes to deck building and playing with your friends. Cole is a very experienced deck builder, probably one of the best in my personal circles. So I think he can provide a lot of insight here, and we're going to be talking about where do you find that good balance between power, fun, and is it right for your own personal play group?
Well, I'm flattered that you'd say that, Corey. But I do think, it's a huge part of Commander is organizing, a game in which everybody is going to have fun. And so even, when we're talking about power versus fun, you have to make that distinction that they don't necessarily, you know, restrict the other. You can have a fun and a powerful deck, or you can have a deck that is fun and is really bad. And those options are what makes Commander so unique.
And I think that's a good point. That they kind of coexist because a lot of times people look at it and go, "Hey, if I make a powerful deck, it's not fun," or if I make a fun deck, it's so janky that there's no chance of it being powerful. But they do kind of go hand in hand. They're not opposites like you would assume. But I think what's the good way to start this off is by kind of defining what we mean by fun or power.
Sure.
Um, because power, I think let's start with power because power is probably the most confused out of them. Like fun, everybody understands what fun is, but power, especially in Commander, tends to get muddled a little bit about what is powerful and what is seems powerful but is not really like busted powerful.
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point. I mean, every game is fatefully started with that one question of like, oh, what power level are we playing, or like what, and so that's a
Mhm.
term that we hear a lot, and it can be a huge, difference between a low power deck and a high power deck, and playing in an environment where you're, unmatched fairly, and you coming up against people who are either curb stomping you with their highly optimized decks, and you're just breaking out a precon, or you're playing your chair tribal deck. It can feel really bad and make it a unfun experience for everyone involved.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that also is where it kind of plays into the fun too, right? Because you could have a potentially okay, so if you could potentially have a fun pod in front of you, but if you're kind of out of your league, so to speak, because your power levels are so different, that could also sap the fun a little bit. Whereas if you were all kind of starting at an even footing, still have fun with everybody kind of being aware of what to expect.
Fun comes from, like, I think, managing your expectations in that sense. And like we talked about it a little bit before the podcast, but you can play a powerful deck in a low power pod as long as you kind of preface it to your play group, saying, hey guys, I've been working really hard on this deck, or you guys know it's my favorite deck, I'd love to get a chance to play it. And then even if everybody is coming out of the gate a little bit of a disadvantage, at least the discussion is there, and they can say, oh, well, that's awesome, I'm excited to see your deck do its thing, or we could try to work together to beat that deck. And that can be a fun experience even when it is mismatched, but it all comes down to communication with your play group.
Yeah, for sure. And listen, I'm sure everybody that's you and I and everybody that's listening to this right now has probably experienced other Magic creators, right? On YouTube, Spotify, wherever, and have heard rule zero 1,000 times,
Hmm.
but it really pays off. Like I've gotten better at it, especially in the last year or so, about having those discussions, and it definitely makes the game smoother, I think.
Absolutely. Just because, I mean, if you're going to be sitting down and playing a game with people for the next, sometimes a couple hours, you want to just all make sure that you're getting off on the proper footing and setting yourself up by being honest with your playgroup and not, trying to beat around the bush that you've snuck in some mana crypts and mana vaults and you're trying to, slam out your, you know, fringe CDH deck on a
Mhm.
couple of noobs. That can be a huge, discriminating factor as well.
Yeah, and also I think speaking of like sneaking out mana crypts and stuff, um, yeah, listen, be honest about what your deck does. You don't have to provide everybody with a complete deck list or here's a link to my Mox Field, printout of this deck.
Right.
But if you tell people, hey, I don't run fast mana, and then your very first turn is like, oh, all right, and mana crypt into whatever basalt monolith, da 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 da, like, maybe just be honest about it.
It can feel a little bit like a bait and switch because if I knew you were going to be playing, if I knew you were going to be playing good and fair Magic, I would want to bust out my good and fair Magic decks.
Yeah, so and same I think same thing. If you have a commander that reads a certain way, but maybe you've got a different build for it, just be honest about it. Actually, you and I had this conversation before about your Scarab God deck, right? Where I think the commander itself comes with a reputation of being a certain power level, but you've intentionally built yours in a different way. And if you have that explanation, people kind of soften to the idea.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point, Corey, because like you said, the Scarab God is like it's a deck that I've worked really hard on optimizing to be as fun to play as possible, and so there have been points where it's been a rather strong deck with, like Cyclonic Rift and Rhystic Study and a lot of like attempting to, take a combo win in the earlier turns, but I have put a lot of effort into kind of neutering that so that it's a deck that I can play with, people of all different power levels. I like to think that because it is if you don't want to know what the Scarab God does, you pay 4 mana. He's a lot of text, but the main ability that I'm using in my deck is that you can pay 4 mana and reanimate a creature out of any graveyard, except it's a 4/4 black zombie instead of what it was before. And so the cool idea behind this is that if you're playing with people who are playing precons, you are limited to the creatures that are in their pre-constructed decks, and vice
Mhm.
versa. If you're playing with people who are running really strong creatures, you can sometimes make a 4/4 dockside extortionist and pop off early if other people are intending to do the same. So it's the great equalizer in my mind.
Yeah, you know what's funny? I like that kind of build personally, where it scales to the table, right? Because you're right in the sense that, hey, you and I especially, we play a lot with a lot of people that have precons,
Hmm.
and we also have people that they took that precon and they've did to the moon. So
Right.
having a deck that you can play at both tables, or even with a mixed pod like that, definitely goes a long way, and it prevents a lot of feel bad moments where you brought out your curb stompy deck. Like, no, I brought out my deck that if everyone's playing at an eight, it's an eight. If everyone's playing at a five, it's a five. It's just very fluid to the situation.
Hmm. And it's worth stating as well that you can always, play a deck that is a bit stronger. And if you, have a game that, or like you pop off immediately and you're curb stomping, you can say, "Hey guys, I'm sorry. Obviously, I misjudged the power level here, and this, clearly this game wasn't an even match. I'll tone it down for the next one, or you guys can, try to play a different deck." Like if you were interpreting it and you're not just sitting there like absorbing the salt and letting everybody, stew, then
Mhm.
you can correct any sort of mismatched power level game.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, we're just talking about strictly the cards and the build too, but I think the player also a role in that, obviously, because I mean, we played together for, I mean, years at this point, and I think you know better than anybody else that I play a lot of out of the box precons, and
An impressive amount.
yeah, probably too many out of the box precons. But I mean, not to brag too much, but I'd like to feel like I hold my own with them. Maybe punch a little above my weight class on them.
I would absolutely agree with that. You are a political player. You like to use a lot of verbal plays as well as your cards in your hand, and it pays
Yeah,
off. And I've seen you take quite a few dubs, and vice versa, Corey. I think we've played, like you said, we've played for a couple years, and I don't know if you've ever seen me play a precon. I have a
hmm
wide variety of decks, and I do have a couple precons, but it's sometimes, I just put so much effort into making my decks the curated experience that they are, that it's hard for me to step away from those and play something that is, different, but
yeah,
also not edited by me.
yeah. So I think that's another thing you can look at too, because you can play an out of the box precon and still have a fun time and still match people's power. You might not be able to match it. Like, I'm not going to say you're going to take it out of the box precon. You're going to have three highly optimized, like CEDH combo decks, and you're going to have a great time. But, in a casual pod, you can still pull your own.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of the, battle cruiser win conditions, if left unchecked, can kind of take a game out of anywhere when there are, somebody who's maybe playing the Scarab God is building up a really threatening board. You can skirt by the sidelines and wait until the removal is blown on my board, and then take the game with your, 31-31 Brina the Demagogue.
Mhm. But but the thing is, if you do that, the first thing you have to do is you have to be willing to put anchors into the floor so the table can't be flipped. Yeah, so I think that's rule number one, right? Well, rule number one is really rule number zero, which is have a rule zero conversation, set everyone's expectation of what you're going to sit down for, because like you said, we're talking, you could be sitting there for an hour, 2 hours, depending on what decks you're playing, and nobody wants to sit for 2 hours having a miserable time.
And we've all had those games. And so if you've had a game like that, you don't want to inflict that onto somebody else. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you.
Now, now on the flip side, though, I will say one of my favorite things is when you come to those people, because like you said, it happens to all of us, where you come to these people who are maybe a little overconfident in their abilities, and they're telling you how powerful they are, and I'm gonna beat you in turn two. Do you see my perfect combo and dismantle it in front of them? Those are
Right.
also pretty memorable moments.
Agreed. There's nothing like kind of shoving it in somebody's face if they're super confident, and showing them that
Mhm.
maybe they shouldn't have underestimated you.
So okay, so we've talked about rule zero, which I think is, we keep bringing up because you cannot understate how important it is. But from a deck building standpoint, I mean, this would be something you can really speak to, because, like you said, you curate a lot of your decks. When you're looking at or evaluating card slots, what do you try and keep in mind when you're balancing this like fun versus power kind of dynamic?
Well, it's easy when you're, building a deck to like want to slot in all the most powerful, most optimized, staples because like you
Mhm.
want to have a fun time, and a lot of the time those kind of cards are going to facilitate that. Like having a Rhystic Study out on turn 2 or 3 means your hand is always full and you have tons of options, and that is fun. But for other people, it can, feel a little bit oppressive if you have a full grip and you're countering everything and just a little bit heavy on the answers. So I'd like to, if you don't mind, just kind of briefly
Yeah.
discuss kind of like when I first started playing Magic. I was playing it in college with a couple of guys who had played for a very long time. This was back in like 2016, and
Okay.
they were really experienced players. And because of that, I was always getting my plans foiled. It always seemed like the perfect moment to strike, and an unexpected counterspell, or God forbid, a mana tithe. And
Mm.
so I had to learn really quickly, and I had to, get better. And some of that came with just, getting a bigger collection and upgrading my decks and kind of getting them to the point where they could hang with these guys who had been playing for, 10, 15 years.
Mhm.
And so when I kind of left that environment and came back to an LG, like in my local, game store and playing with my friends, I had to kind of like take a moment and assess all my decks because they had been built to the standard that I could have fun in that high power environment. But bringing them back down to a lot of my friends who were just getting into Magic meant that I was taking home pretty much every dub. And that's not a good feeling for, it was a good feeling for me, but it's not a good feeling for everyone. Um,
It's it comes back to like know your play group as well because you're right. So in that context, your fun was foiling your friend and getting to see that look on their face.
right.
Whereas with a stranger, maybe that's not a sweet thing you're gonna savor because you're just gonna see their miserable look on their face and then go home.
Exactly. Which, if it's a stranger, you might not ever see them again. But on the flip side, if you go to that game store regularly, you don't want to build up a reputation as somebody who just curb stomps and leaves. So it's
And if you
important
do
to.
that,
What was that?
I was gonna say, and if you do that to your friend, and actually, sometimes depending if you know your friends just right, and you do that to your friend, that just becomes a story that gets told over and over again about, oh, you won't believe the one time Cole did this to me. I had my perfect deck, and he, took that pie and rubbed it all in my face.
Yeah, you manatee the guy's soul ring once, and you never hear the end of it. Soul ring. Any response?
Oh,
Um,
no.
so when I was in that environment, and I had to kind of make my decks really strong, one thing that I noticed that was I would say kind of a bad deck building habit was I had, one copy of, the card I've been talking about all the cast has been Rhystic Study, but I had one copy of
Manatide.
Rhystic Study. I've mentioned that one a couple times too. But you best believe that every single blue deck that I played had a printed out, proxy of my Rhystic Study in that deck. And because I had
Mhm.
one, I deserve to play it in all my decks. And like, I don't want to,
Sure.
obviously, I don't want to spend the money on buying, 3 or 4 more Rhystic Studies. But what that ended up kind of turning into was every single deck I played had a Rhystic Study in it. So there's never a chance
Mm.
for any of my friends to play a game where I wasn't looking for or trying to play Rhystic Study. Or did you pay the one? Did you pay the one? They heard that all the time. And
Uh-huh.
so I kind of had this moment of realization that proxying out my decks in that manner meant that every one of my decks had the same, 20 cards at base. Like they were that much, less unique than another deck that had maybe forced substitutions because of budget, or like, oh, maybe obviously I have to think of another way to solve this problem. And so I kind of took that and ran with it and removed all those extra copies of Rhystic Study, and I now have one deck at a time that is like, oh, I will maybe have a study in this, or I'll something to that effect, where I'm spreading out the power. That way my friends don't have to deal with the same threats and the same bullshit, excuse me, uh,
Mhm.
but every game.
Yeah, and that's a good point too, because I mean we can have a whole separate debate on people have on the Soul Ring, Arcane Signet kind of thing of how detrimental is that to deck building when you go every deck has a Soul Ring and then every deck has an Arcane Signet and you're making less and less slots for uniqueness. So I mean, those things are staples for a reason, heuristic studies and stuff. But yeah, if it's in every single deck that runs blue, what are you not playing that in there?
And there's enough fun alternatives out there that you can, find something that does a similar job and can show, a unique card that would probably wouldn't get played in any other format. Like
Mhm.
an exact example for Ristic Study is a really great card called Verity Circle. It's a blue card. I believe it costs 3, and it states that whenever a creature becomes tapped for a non-combat reason, you get to draw a card. And so that's just like it's a little different. It's not every single spell. It's but you're gonna be finding that effect a lot more than you'd think. Like a lot of people have, like oh that Arbor Elf is now drawing you a card, or small things like
Mhm.
that where you can find that same power, but in a more like sustainable way for your playgroup.
And I think too, people can look at this too as like your deck is allowed to be fluid, right? So as you grow and change as a player, I think we talked about this beforehand, but you can look at let's say a precon, right?
Hmm.
And go, most precons that come out have one like direct focus that comes with their face commander, and then 1 to 2 kind of suboptimal side themes.
Right.
So if you have that deck, you can increase the power level on it and therefore increase the fun just by making the deck run smoother, which also, again, like I said, probably makes it more powerful. But then at a certain point, you can have that deck fully powered up and then realize, hey, now it's kind of outstripped my play group. Or maybe you've gotten to the point where you're trying to teach other people how to play the game, and it's just not a fun deck to bring out against them. And you can always remove some cards, bring it back down a little bit. Later when they get better, maybe you want to put those cards back in. Like, there's nothing wrong with your 100 cards, the
Right.
shifting over the years as you have that deck.
Absolutely. I think like it's a part of a journey, building your deck from a point where it's, all the cards are unique to you, or like maybe you've, got a precon and you're editing it 5 to 10 cards at a time. And that is the fun of like seeing how you can make small
Mm-hmm.
changes that, like you said, make your deck run a lot more fluid. Like the mana base is a huge one. Having your lands come in untapped is awesome. Like if you're playing a one color, a monocolor deck, you kind of get the benefit of all your lands are basics, so you don't have to worry about the tap lands, the bounce lands, all that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're
Now,
playing like the upcoming 5 color sliver precon, you're gonna have a lot of turns where you're not able to. You just need that one more mana, and all you have is a rugged highland, and you play it and you gain 1 life, but it comes in
one
tapped.
of the one of the things on this little side tangent, but one of the things I actually realized the other day, I was making a list of the decks I have,
Hmm.
and I have no monocolor decks in my arsenal.
Interesting.
I don't know how it happened. I think, you know what? I think it actually is a curse of everything being a precon to begin with, because most of them are 2 to 3 colors these days.
Well, if you're looking for a no color precon, I got good news for you.
Come on down.
If you had to make a deck right now for a monocolored commander, who do you think it would be?
Okay, so this was a question of the week, episode or two ago.
Well, I think I know your
Dylan and I,
answer from that episode.
yeah, so Dylan and I were talking about what commanders, because we were looking at underused commanders, and we were talking about which ones we had kind of influenced each other or sold each other on was the
Hmm.
question. Um, and of the monocolor, I'm running through them in my mind right now, but of the monocolor, and we did a colorless. Valda Keeper the Flame, I think, was the one that jumped out to me the most, which was a mono red, makes like 3/1 trampling. I want to say they're elementals off the top
Hmm.
of my head. But it makes 3/1 trampling elementals with haste that gets sacrificed at the end of the turn based off of the number of aura and equipment on him.
Oh yeah.
So that looked like a lot of fun.
Well, I just you mentioning that you have no monocolored decks. That's a you haven't gotten the joy of the full basic experience.
Yeah. Now I will say there are plans in place to correct that. So I've got a small stack of commanders in front of me that are in like a to be built if I ever find the time stack, and I think there's three monocolors in there. I know there's at least. Oh yeah, there are three because I've got Light Paws in there. I have Valduck, and I've got Jin Gataxius, the Neon Dynasty one.
Oh, very fun.
So that could correct it and make like 3 of 5 monocolors already.
Well, that's awesome.
But yeah, going back to your original point with the land base or the mana base, I that is one of those things where fixing it instantly gives you a power boost, I think.
A
But
consistency boost.
yeah, you know what? That's the correct word. Not a power boost. It gives you a consistency boost because it does increase power, but again, it also increases fun because there's nothing more fun than being able to play the cards you have, and there's nothing more frustrating to have a handful of cards you can't play because your mana base is not correct.
Right. Playing spells is kind of that's the reason we all play Magic. So you want to be able to do that frequently and often, and being able to start your engines on turn one and keep those engines humming is the difference between a deck that is you're
Mm.
right. It does create a bit of a power difference just because the expectation when you play a deck with a land base that's going to come in untapped is that you're going to be casting more spells. You're going to be making more use of your turns because you're not capping your mana at a lower number.
Yeah, and I mean, you can tell me if you think about this differently, but the way I always like to look at decks when I build them is whatever my commander's mana value is, I try to build the deck in a way where I'm assuming it'll come out the turn before. So if it's a commander and let's say it's two colorless and two of whatever its color identity is, assuming or I'm trying to build the deck in a way where I get it out on turn 3.
Right.
Um so on that sense, having a good mana base does speed that along, and with speed does come more power, like you said, because you're casting more spells. But it also just makes things more fun because more people at the table are doing things, and there's a better experience, I think, as opposed to one person's things and the other three people are spectating.
Right. Which again is fun for that one person, but it can be it can be a little much to sit through that for an extended period of time. Um,
Now, let me ask you this.
hmm.
When we're looking at strategies, do you think there's any because a lot of people talk about like, oh, this strategy is unfun. I don't want to sit at a table where people are playing stacks, stuff like that. How much of a role do you think strategies of your opponents really play in your play experience?
Well, that's a really great point. Like there are a lot of strategies that are considered to be unfun. Like infect, stacks, mill. These are
Mhm.
all categories that like people who haven't really played against them, or maybe they've played too much against them, can have a pretty strong opinion of. I'm kind of in the
Mhm.
boat that I like to play against anything. I'm not gonna turn you down if you're playing a mass land destruction, stacks, infect, mill deck. But I'll play against it once, and if it's
You've
absolutely
got all
dreadful,
of them in there.
right, right, right. And if it's the worst, I'm not going to play against it over and over and over again. But I'm willing to give it a try. Some, and then there's other, categories within that. Like obviously, mass land destruction is objectively a little less fun than, mill, but mill is a
Mhm.
sore point for a lot of people because they hate to see their fun cards go into the graveyard. Whereas I am a lover of mill. I play a lot of graveyard decks, put those cards into my graveyard, and then I can access them. I like to, be on that kind of solo win condition, and that's a
Mhm.
fun game plan for me. So everybody sees fun differently, and those, if you're playing an infect deck and it is just curb stomping your friends or your local game store, then
Mhm.
maybe they need to adjust their decks to withstand it. But also, if you're pulling some cheap shots, you got to understand why people might feel like it's unfun. It all comes down to your portrayal of the deck.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point too, because okay, if you're playing a full pod of Commander where you have 4 players,
The perfect game.
y- correct? Yeah, sure. I think to a lot of people, so stacks, mill, things of that nature. I think the reason why they get so hated, I guess for lack of a better term, is a lot of people unfortunately come into with the mindset that they're going to play solitaire, and I'm going
Sure.
to build my board, no one's going to touch my stuff, and all that. So I think some of those strategies kind of get like unfairly frowned upon. Now, if you're playing mass land destruction, yeah, it's objectively unfair because you're actually preventing people from playing at all. Same for
But
like hyper aggressive stacks, I think.
to some extent, but it's also like a new challenge in the game. Like I love a good collector oof or something to that extent, where you
Uh-huh.
now have to think of a creative solution to the problem, or like a simple tax effect, like any sort of Thalia, like adding 1 mana cost to each of your spells. If you're accounting for it, it doesn't have to be this like, oh my god, he's slowing down the game. The game's so slow. If you are accounting for it into your turn, you're like, okay, well, it's just basically we're playing, with a little bit less resources. The game can still go just as quickly and just take the game in a whole different direction than you may be used to. But like you said, people sit down with the expectation that they're going to get to, everybody wants to pop off. And so if you're playing a strategy that prevents that person from popping off, they might not have as much fun, but where
Mhm.
they derive their fun from shouldn't be winning, because you're only, estimated to win like 25% of games if everybody is at
Mhm.
that even power level. And so if they're going to lose, they should be able to take that. And if sometimes it's just that simple of your deck is not a good match.
Yeah. It's weird in Magic to think about it, but I think one of the easiest or most accessible like games out there to figure out would be like Pokemon, right? Because there's type weaknesses. And
Sure.
same thing in Magic in that same degree. Like, listen, if you've got a slow artifact heavy build and the person across from you is running a lot of artifact destruction, it's not gonna be a bed of roses for you. Um, Now you might play that same deck against somebody else in that same exact pod, and you've got the advantage on their deck because they don't have a lot of removal.
Well, I mean, there's a great example of this last weekend. We were playing a game and against one of our friends with a artifact-based deck, and I
Mhm.
happened to rip a Vandal Blast off the top. And I had to cast it, but it destroyed his entire board and a couple of his lands because he had those fancy schmancy artifact lands. Uh,
Mhm.
that's just sometimes the way the cookie crumbles.
Yeah, and also I think if you're on the receiving end of that, you also have to realize that look, everything that sets you back is not stacks or it's not a hate piece. So, so if you like a lot of people frown on Augustine,
Yeah, Grand Arbiter
Augustine the
Augustin
Fourth.
the Fourth.
Now, is he stacks? I mean, you could argue that, but I would say he's not as bad as looking at a stasis or a winter orb.
No, if you've ever been orb locked, which my first deck, Atraxa, the Praetor's Voice, evolved into a absolutely degenerate Winter's Orb, Static Orb based strategy to deal with my crazy playgroup. If you've ever been in an orb lock, you know that a Grand Arbiter is nothing compared to that. And all that it takes is like your attitude, and when facing those things, like I've played games against a Grand Arbiter where everybody's kind of bummed out, but if you take it easy and you just, hey, well, I can't cast that because it's got it costs one more mana, you play accordingly, you
Mhm.
can kind of like lighten the mood for other people. Like it doesn't have to be this, because that can be awkward for the person who's playing stacks, which is a valid strategy, and
Sure.
they shouldn't be punished for it by being socially ostracized by your group.
Yeah, which is fair because again, so ideally you had that rule zero conversation, so you weren't blindsided when they placed him in the command zone and then started playing a stacks deck, or if you saw Derevi in the command zone or any of those kind of classic stacks based commanders.
And like
Presumably, you talked about this ahead of time.
and kind of related to our other example, if you're playing that deck that is super heavy in artifact hate, and you see somebody, hopefully it's one of your friends, and they know they've played against this deck before, and for whatever reason they're choosing to take their punishment, their torture in that matchup. But if you are actively about to engage in somebody's counter strategy, you can just say, hey man, maybe this isn't a good matchup, maybe we should change up decks. Like, what do you think? Like, does this sound like it's going to be fun for you? I'm planning on blowing up everybody's artifacts every turn. My deck is a Vandal Blast loop deck. It's really specific, but it gets the job done
Mhm.
in the certain pods. You know.
Yeah, and that's valid too because we talked about when we went to Command Fest. I sat down in a game with another creator, and she wanted to play one of the Lord of the Rings precons. Now, I had brought out my only decks that I've altered from the precon. That's maybe 20 cards are still the same if we're not counting basic lands.
Right.
And as soon as I saw precon, I started shuffling my deck away. She said it was okay to play, and I'm like, no, no, it's got a tutor and it's got this and that, and I understood like that would not have been an enjoyable experience.
You read the room.
So it's okay if you see somebody bring out a deck and hey, I'm gonna just demolish them based off of what you've already said on the table. Hey, look, you can scoop it up. Now I'm not saying try and game the system and go, oh, I've got the perfect deck that's going to destroy them and let me swap into that. But if you kind of know where the game's headed, you've played with this person before, it's okay to kind of offer to swap into a deck that's at like a neutral level with them.
There's a huge difference between doing that aggressively and doing that, preemptively to avoid a bad game experience.
Right. And I think where this is especially important is when it comes to newer players. Because for you and I, we could sit down at an event or something like that, and somebody just pulls out their commander, and you kind of have an idea what the commander is, what it's going to do. But if you don't have that card pool knowledge, you may not like if I sit down at a table and somebody's like, "Well, I have Toxrill and I'm brand new," that doesn't mean anything to me, but I could be in for a miserable experience if I've got my creature heavy deck.
Your 1/1 counters deck is going to have a bad
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
Well, first off, if you're playing Toxrill against a new player, you need to check yourself before you wreck yourself.
I'm picturing somebody that's like, "Hey guys, I just scooped up my precon and it's Toxrill,
Kalia the
Turgrid,
Vast. Turgrid, yeah, yeah.
yes, or Yuriko." Like it's just somebody just
Yeah, that sounds like
now,
a really great new player experience.
yeah, you're gonna learn, you know. If you haven't learned the game, you're about to. And I think too, as a experienced player, right?
Yeah.
Do you feel, because I kind of feel like this in a little bit, but do you feel like you have a responsibility to the rest of your pod to kind of shepherd them into the game by curating those fun experiences?
Yeah, I think that's a kind of a responsibility, but you have to play your cards right in that sense of like another big difference between letting somebody win and kind of like taking
Mhm.
away that special moment, and then also like seeing somebody about to have a really cool play and understanding that if they're new to the game, sometimes those really cool plays that they've probably seen you do 100 times, that's the
Mhm.
moment that might like get them on that hook or like, oh my god, I have an Avenger of Zendikar, and I played a Cultivate, and I played a land for
It's
turn.
all coming together.
It's all coming together. Maybe you don't immediately, respond with something, and oh, sorry, like maybe that shouldn't have happened because of your trigger.
Mhm.
Like sometimes you kind of have to recognize when the gain of them having that experience and like falling that much more in love with the game is worth more than you being like, um, actually, you couldn't have done that because of this, specific rules interaction, which is important because you obviously don't want anybody to learn how to play the game with the wrong rules. But
Mhm.
sometimes you just gotta let people have that, yes, that huge haymaker moment.
Yeah, I agree. I've definitely had moments where, like, when teaching somebody, and they finally, it's like something clicked in their brain, and they figured out how to make this cool combo with their deck, or they figured out, how to string certain things together to have their big moment. I have definitely held a counterspell up as opposed to casting it.
Sure.
Um, and because, like you said, yes, you want them to realize maybe the issue, but you're not in it to just curb stomp, your friend, because ideally you're helping them out, get on that hook, and then you can have games in the future where you play that counterspell.
Yeah, you can teach them not to cast their, 9 mana, Rise of the Dark Realms when I have 2 mana open, bro. I'm playing a blue deck. Like, what am I supposed to do? Let the negate just sit there? But if you, take that away from them in the very beginning, it can kind of be a discouraging moment. Um, Now, like with my old play group, I got beat down. I don't know if I won a single game in my first year of playing. And what that did for me was made me a very scornful and spiteful deck builder. And I went home and I built the fastest Krinko Mob Boss deck I could, muster up with my college student income, which was low. And I came back with an intent to play, meaner and, take those times to be, I'm going to react, I'm going to respond, and I'm going to foil other people's plans. And it was a really great way to level up and learn, but also
Mhm.
being a very competitive person, I had that drive. If I had been any slightly weaker willed, playing for a year and just getting Atraxa counterspelled, just like in, Chaos Warp, like
Mhm.
every removal spell under the sun, Pongify, Generous Gift, Beast Within, Rapid Hybridization, like just over and over and over again. You can only cast Atraxa for 16, so many times before you're like,
Uh-huh.
I don't know if this game is for me. I don't know if this game is for me.
Yeah, and you know what? And that's comes back to know your play group, right? So if you learn best through like a trial by fire, like, hey, obviously what drove you deeper into the game was your competitive nature and your passion to give them comeuppance for everything they put you through. But you also have to know there are other people out there that are like, if that happens, it's just so discouraging. So just kind of know who you're playing with.
Right. Read the room.
Which, I think it sounds like we're beating a dead horse, but really that's the most important thing, right? Is have a rule zero, read the room, set expectations, kind of just be a good ambassador for the game you're trying to hook people into. Now, if they, a year from now, if they try and play the same shenanigan they try to play, game one, or hey, tap those 2 blue mana, counterspell them back to the Stone Age. At that point, they deserve it.
Absolutely. Um, Well, like you said, we've been talking a lot about like rule zero conversation and that sort of thing. I think it's also important to talk about like ways that you can kind of meter the power of your own deck by making, substitutions. Like if you have a deck that's super strong, you can weaken it by taking out a lot of those like super consistent low mana ramp spells or all of your draw engines. But you can also
Hmm.
weaken it by just kind of including some bigger boss monstery, battle cruiser style cards. Like if you have a pet card that makes you super happy because you played it back when you were 13 playing Magic for the first time, that can be
Hmm.
a like a something that's maybe not optimized, but it's something that you can whip out and slam down on the table and just be kind of excited to see the table's reaction. And you don't have to worry about, oh, this Cyclonic Rift was like, maybe this was poorly timed and everybody feels like I'm playing a too strong of a deck. When instead of that, you're, busting out a well-timed Aether Spouts or, something to
Hmm.
that effect, which does a similar job but creates a better game narrative.
Well, here's you're right. Game narrative is a better phrase than what I was going to use, which was the same point. But when you leave a game, let's say you go to Command Fest, you leave, or you go to your LGS for Friday Night Magic, which hopefully you're on your way to as you're listening to this. Um, you and you go back and you start telling people about, hey, here's this game I got into. You're more likely to tell somebody the tale of how the person across from you pulled out that huge battle cruiser card or pulled out that big 8 mana ever and did some crazy board tilting effect over slowly nickel and dimed me with 1, 2 mana. And man, his mana curve efficiency was fantastic.
It can be a lot more memorable when you've got those big splashy haymakers.
You should have seen the cantrips he cast. But yeah, I completely agree. And Commander is unique. And I don't know if you would agree or disagree, but I think Commander is very unique in that it's one of the few formats where you actually have a home for those kind of pet cards.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of the only formats. It's,
Mhm.
you can put anything from 1993 onwards on, and if you played for a long time, you'll have those cards that you every time you draw it, you're like, yes, regardless of if it's any good.
Now, let me ask you this because I think I've got a good example of this in my deck building process, but do you have any example of, let's say, like a pet card that you keep around because it's, maybe it's suboptimal, but you've gotten such good memories out of it, such fun, playthroughs that it's still in a deck?
Absolutely. I have a really fun card from Weatherlight. It's a pretty old
Mhm.
card. It's called Bone Dancer, and it's a black and a black and one for a zombie, a 2/2 with the ability pay 0 and put the top creature card of the defending player graveyard into play under your control. Bone Dancer deals no combat damage this turn, and you can only use this ability if Bone Dancer is attacking and unblocked, and only once each turn. So if you're in the perfect game, you get Bone Dancer out on turn 3. Somehow you've managed to either mill your opponents or they've maybe discarded some awesome
Mhm.
creatures. And if they tried to shuffle, look through their graveyard, you said, "Whoa, you got to keep that in order," because I have one of the few cards where it's relevant. Uh,
Mhm.
you're getting some gas out of that. Now, how have I ever pulled off a play where Bone Dancer did something cooler than receiving a Sakura Tribe Elder or a Solemn Simulacrum? No. But
So
the
there's
idea
no
of it and the fear when I play the Bone Dancer that something cool like that could happen is what drives this awful card, I mean this really nice card, into every mono black deck that I play.
so what you're telling me is to date you have yet to connect and pull like an Ulamog out of somebody's graveyard.
Believe it or not, no. I've yet to pull any sort of boss monster, but the moment I do,
Mhm.
everybody's gonna just flip their lid because they've seen Bone Dancer. They know it's a card that I could be playing something stronger. For 3 mana and
Mhm.
black, you could play Opposition Agent. You could play Black Market Connections. There's a million different things that you could play
Yeah.
for 3 mana and black. But because I have this kind of suboptimal card with a really cool art, it's something that I'm excited about playing, even if at the end of the day it's pretty much a vanilla 2/2.
And I think there's something fun to be said about when you can play a card and you put it down on the table and everybody squints and goes, "What does that do?"
Right, right. That utter confusion. That is
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah, I think I've got for me, and I'm pretty sure you know what this is going to be, but it's worst fears in
Oh yeah.
my so it's ridiculously fun, easily counterable. Um,
In
so
some circumstances, in some
in some
cases.
yeah, in some cases, but in my Hello deck, which is a spell copying deck because it gives your first instant and sorcery each turn casualty 2, so you can copy it. Um, the optimal build, we'll start with that, is to pack it full of extra turn spells and then copy them a bunch between casualty and twinning staff and double visions and all these other kind of built-in copying mix, and just go, all right, I'm going to take the next whatever 4 or 5 turns and watching me play. I run no extra turn spells because it's I think this is a good example. I run 0 extra turn spells in the deck that's built to just pop off with extra turn spells because I don't think it's fun for you to watch me play. And I don't want to sit there for 20 minutes playing by myself, having people stare at me, wonder if my turn's over.
Right.
So in its place, I run Worse Fears, which is a sorcery that lets me take control of other people's turns. So I like to copy that whenever possible and just play everybody else's turn. So it's kind of like I'm getting extra turns, but I'm getting to do it with a new set of cards every single time.
I mean, we got to talk about that game. The first Command Fest that we ever went
Mhm.
to, our first game of Command Fest,
There
I was
was
rosy cheeked, feeling,
mhm,
happy, feeling everything was good in the
the
world.
fresh the
Uh,
fresh dew had fallen on the morn.
Playing my aforementioned Scarab God deck against this
Oh,
absolute degenerates and Hello deck.
it was Scarab God.
And it's relevant because Scarab God has an ability that when I'll get to it in a minute, but
Mhm.
basically you would cast Worst Fears on me. I attempted to counterspell the Worst Fears, and because you would cast it with Casualty and you'd copied somebody else's turn, uh, I countering the version of it that's targeting me because that's the messed up thing. It's not easy to counter when it's copied immediately on cast because then you need 2 counterspells to get rid of it.
Right.
You took control of my turn. You used my Putrid Imp to discard my entire hand, and you sent my commander to the graveyard, into the graveyard. And
Mhm.
when given the choice to either send it to the command zone or keep it in the graveyard, you said, "Yeah, I'm gonna keep it in the graveyard." Well, Scarab God, he goes back to my hand at the end of my turn, but you chose not to do that. It's a May trigger, and you chose not to do that. So
I may not.
it was an utterly game-changing play because I went from having a board state to having nothing in my hand, no commander, and no permanents.
If I remember too, just out of spite, I think I tapped all your land too. Not
Y-
that you had anything to cast.
The cherry on top, if you will.
Yeah. Um yeah, which again, at the end of the day, right, did it get me to the same place, which was taking another turn? Yes. But did I have a lot more fun doing it? Yeah, yeah, objectively yes, and I would argue it was probably more fun even though it might have been miserable in the moment to watch your stuff go away. It was probably more fun as a whole for the table.
Well, it's a story that, we still talk about to this day, and it wouldn't have been that case if you just played an additional extra turn spell.
Hmm. Now, today to this day, I've definitely upgraded that deck. There are things in there that are degenerately disgusting on power level, like Demonic Tutor. Um, but I still keep that card in there. It's the most expensive card in the entire deck, mana wise, and I just can't bring myself to cut it because hey, it might whiff. If you have nothing for me to interact with, it might whiff, but if not, it's blast for me, a blast for other people.
Well, that's a really good point. First off, I don't think Demonic Tutor ever whiffs unless your library is empty. You're pretty much you're getting, it's any card in your deck. It ain't
Oh,
whiffing.
for
But like you said, like if you have a card that is, really powerful or really strong, like if you've been playing for a long time and you've accumulated those, strong older cards or a new card that's, changing the tide of your, local format, it's not a bad thing to play those cards. Like you should still, have the space to put them in and say like, oh, this is a card I love, or this is a card that I've, won so
mhm.
many games with it. It brings me a lot of happiness. You should be allowed to play those. It's just if you're excessive about it. Like if you're, playing Demonic Tutor, Grim Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, and packing your deck full of tutors, you're increasing your consistency and thusly increasing your power level. But putting like a singular tutor for that one moment that you're like, I don't know if I need removal, I don't know if I need, a win con. It's a really great way to express your knowledge of your deck that you built and that, oh, I put this in here so I could find the answer.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that too, right? So tutors, when you look at a power level thing, tutors I think are the first thing that people point to and go, "Oh, your deck is powerful because it has tutors." Um, yes and no, because for me, yes, it increases consistency, which, as we established, can increase power. But a demonic tutor or vampiric tutor or whatever is really only as good as what you're pulling in the situation.
Sure.
So, I mean, because I've seen people where they've vampiric tutored to get a soul ring because it's turn one, and they're like, oh, why am I going to get my 7 mana win con that I can't cast?
And if you're playing a jankier deck, if you're playing a deck that, like we said earlier, the chair tribal deck, like, and
Mhm.
you're, on that lower than a precon power level, maybe you just need the tutor to get your weird Maskwood Nexus, chair engine going. Um, and that can, it all is like like you said, it's not the spell that's strong, it's what you're grabbing with it. If you're
Mhm.
in a play group where, grabbing that Aether Spouts is like what's going to cause you to have that awesome play when your buddy swings at you with his, board full of creatures, then that helps facilitate a more fun time. But if you're using it to search out your win condition and achieve a victory on turn 3 or 4 consistently, then you're, maybe need to take a step back and say like, is everybody else enjoying me rush to this win con?
Mhm. Well, and that also circles back to the turn zero talk. Now, one of the things I've seen more and more people do that I really appreciate when it comes to those talks is instead of doing the power level, like the 1 through 10 power level, discussing it more in terms of speed of the deck. Because, there's that whole commander joke that everything's a 7 because nobody knows what's not a 7.
Right.
But if you say, okay, look, we're going to sit down. My deck is going to has whatever 10 tutors in it or some ridiculous number, and I'm going to find my win con by turn 3 and win. Okay, that's great. If everybody's okay winning or rushing to turn 3, that's a perfectly acceptable, fun table. Also, probably very powerful based off of the speed.
Yeah.
You know, But if your goal is to win by turn 3 and the person across from you's goal is to win by turn 10, it's probably not going to be a fun time for the turn 10 player.
And it's also worth stating though that if you're playing like a stack or something to that effect, which the goal is to slow down the game and then take control of it, your later win con might not necessarily translate to a lower power level. Like there are a lot of, competitive EDH builds around stacks, and just, having that like, I'm probably not going to win on turn 4 doesn't mean that your deck isn't, well enough handled to lock the game out and achieve a victory by drawing out your opponents in 100 turns, or, something to that
Mhm.
effect.
Yeah, which is true because if you're not rushing to the victory, you're right. A stacks deck is kind of doing the opposite, which is okay. I'm going to bring everybody to my speed.
Hmm. Or slower.
Um, yeah,
Ideally
yeah,
slower, because you want those
ideally slower.
asymmetrical stack spaces, yeah.
Yeah, which I mean, when it comes to really when it comes to any strategy that affects the board, if your plan is to win, it's how can I get more resource value out of this than the person next to me.
Hmm.
So yeah, I 100% agree. Now, if you were a brand new player or you're teaching a brand new player, I mean, what would you recommend that you start on a lower power scale or jump into the deep end?
Well, yeah. So I think the best way to start is, playing a precon, ideally in a group of people playing precons, or just playing
Mhm.
something at that kind of power level, because it gives you an idea of, like, the good old days of Commander, where you weren't, dumping your wallet into TCG Player and trying to get your deck super well optimized. Like when you have those genuine moments that come from like weird cards that you're, never going to play again because it's an 8 mana card that gets you, one land to the battlefield but does something else, kind of crazy. That's where I think the love of Commander, and then it gets you that interest in getting deeper into the game. Like maybe you're like, okay, well that was fun, but I didn't love spending 3 hours sitting here. I'd love it to be a bit faster. So you kind of put some effort into, upgrading it. I think playing, if you do happen to like, like we play with both of our girlfriends who,
Mhm.
when they got into it, I mean, I've been playing for, like quite some time, so having a large variety of decks, think was really good at getting my girlfriend up to speed, at where I could feel like she's a good a good player and a good opponent, because she's seen so many different archetypes, and she's, seen the bullshit, and she knows how to handle it. And anytime anybody plays anything that I would consider maybe a salty card, she's always the first person to say like, oh, well, that was a fun game, like I didn't mind playing against that, because, at the end of the day, it really wasn't that bad. It helped me see, like, wow, I mean, that is a strong strategy to make it so all artifacts can't do anything. Or like we played a game with the Grand Arbiter, and, and I made a copy of somebody's Grand Arbiter, so she had to spend
Mhm.
2 extra mana to cast any spell. And I was like thinking I'm gonna get an earful of this in the car ride home, but she was, like, wow, that was crazy, like having to, spend that extra 2, like the taxes, like, she took it really well. And I think if you are kind of like sheltered in only seeing, precons, it can be a little bit culture shock when you sit down and you play against something that, breaks that narrative.
Yeah, I think I think you should always give a deck a chance, especially if you're new. Like, hey, look, maybe you don't like playing against a stacks deck, or maybe you don't like playing against some control deck or something like that. But at least try it once, because maybe you find out you don't mind it as much as you'd think. I
a,
think,
a lot of it comes down to that. It's if you play it, it can open your eyes to its weaknesses. That's something that people talk about a lot. Is like, if you're up against a deck that's like giving you a ton of trouble, you should ask to be like, hey man, can I play it? Like I'd love to just see how it works from the driver's seat. And then once you're, in there and you're looking through the deck, you're like, wow, this isn't as unbeatable as I thought. Or like there are some glaring weaknesses that are hard to see when you're distracted by all the, pretty lights.
yeah, and I've had this conversation before too. Not necessarily on this podcast, but I've had this conversation before with like other creators and stuff, which is, in my opinion, now I've had them disagree with me.
Uh-huh.
Um, so I'll preface this with, in my opinion, um, sometimes a lot of things you hear on the internet is not really factual to, or I was not necessarily not factual, but not necessarily accurate to your average play experience. For example, you're gonna hear, if you're new to this game and you go on YouTube and you're looking up like cards that should be banned or saltiest cards or this or this and this. You're gonna see people talk about dockside extortionist. You're gonna see people talk about, oh, Toxrill's one of the most salty commanders,
Right.
or but I can I'll be honest with you, I could go with you to an LGS tonight, and the odds that a dockside extortionist is going to get played on, I mean, maybe, but not as highly likely as you would probably believe just listening to YouTube.
Right. When you're in an environment like an LGS versus the honed environment of a content creator's, play group or like their
Mhm.
vast collection, there's a difference in the average, card quality that you're going to see. But vice versa, sometimes you're at an LGS and somebody's going to bust out their blinged out, $2,500 Gishath Sun's Avatar deck. And when they do, it's typically pretty freaking cool.
Yeah, so I think it's smart to be aware that these cards exist out there, but at the same time, yes. So a lot of those gameplay videos you're going to see online or on a content creator stream, stuff like that, you have to realize a lot of the decks are built for an entertainment value. So you're going to see your dock sides, your cyclonic rifts, your you know someone mana drained to do this and that, and you're going to see these big flashy kind of things happen because that's what they're built around. But that might not necessarily be your genuine play experience. So it's always good to know they exist, but just be aware they're maybe not the biggest boogeyman in the format, in my opinion.
Absolutely. There are worse things, and when you experience them, you'll know.
Yeah, and I'll go one step further and go, if you know somebody that has that in their deck, you're gonna remember who they are. Like if we sit down on a pod and you play Cyclonic Rift, it's gonna register somewhere in my brain that next time you play that deck, you'll have a Cyclonic Rift in it.
Which you don't want to necessarily have like a in-game memory or to that extent of like your oh well I think I know who I'm gonna attack first, but it does kind of
Mhm.
naturally happen like when you play with people and you kind of can gauge the power of their decks. You can be like, well, I know what you're playing. I know what cards are in your deck. I know that we should attack you, we should focus you. But if we were in a perfect game environment where everybody, had no
It's kind of
knowledge of the
blind.
cards in each other's
Mhm.
decks, you might play differently. And in that situation, I hit the guy whose deck I know, 99% of the time, just because that's our meta. That's what's fun for me. But I would
Now,
be, willing to change on that if I was convinced.
I'll tell you, you brought it up a little bit ago that I'm more of like a political at the table player.
Oh yeah.
Um, I think you have to, for me, anyways, I get a lot of fun out of the showmanship of the politics. So if I know you have a Cyclonic Rift or whatever the scary thing is in your deck, you best believe I'm telling the entire table, oh, hey, you should attack Cole. Cole has this, Cole has that. Even if you don't, oh, Cole's got Mana Crypt in there. Ho, 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 you better watch out. You know?
Right. Now I'll have you know I don't own a single mana crypt. I will have you know. But
Putting
I,
it
I
on
do hear
record.
you.
Yeah, and I think that I've touched on this, and I think you've touched on this as well, which is your personality at the table can also make unfun experiences more fun.
And
So if
vice
you
versa.
know,
It can make fun
yeah, yeah,
experiences very unfun.
yeah, I think we've all sat at a pod before where the deck looks super cool and then is being piloted by the most monotone zombie or even the most brazenly cocky and that you just, hey, look, I want to wrap up this game and not look at you again.
Oh, absolutely.
But on the flip side, I think we've also had miserable decks. Like, oh man, they're playing this super miserable deck, but they're joking, they're having fun, they're this, Or when you make a counter against their deck, they're like, "Oh man, I can't believe you stopped me. I thought my deck was so powerful. Hey, good for you. That's an amazing play you made."
Right.
So, in the same sense, you want to be complimented for doing crazy stuff at the table. So does the person, across from you. So, if they do insane spells, give them that sugar to keep them on the hook.
That's a really good point. Like you can encourage people to like play those, more fun cards by like if somebody does something crazy that you never see before because maybe it isn't like super optimized and it's not like, your best choice of a card slot. You could say after the game, "Hey man, that was a really cool play. Like I've never seen that card before. Like what a crazy effect that seriously warped the game." And it can encourage people to like want to come out with their unique builds and their interesting cards if they're not feeling like, oh, the only thing I can get out of this game is winning.
Yeah, and like you said, winning is far from guaranteed in a commander game. So if you're looking at a 25%, like you said, if everybody's at the same power level, everything kind of runs equal. Um, so look for having fun over necessarily like winning is everything. I mean, unless there's like money on the line or something, then yeah, sure,
Then
win.
that's a different story. Yeah,
You
winning is
know?
everything in that one. But like yeah,
Yeah.
you have to be able to find the fun in the smaller things. Like maybe you have your pop off turn where everybody treats you as the arch enemy. That's a super fun experience.
Mhm.
It's you can have fun by completing your objective. We played a game with Ken EDH, who a
Yeah.
really nice guy, and he had a Corpse Queen playmat, which is another old black card that I am super fond of, and I played a deck that had it in there. And when I finally got to my Corpse Queen and I was able to play it, I had felt like I'd won the game because like that was the whole reason I played that deck was just to show off like yeah it's a cool old card and I have a use for it. Like that's a separate win condition even if you're not taking home the dub.
Oh yeah, and even for that game there, I mean, he was playing a Rocco deck, not
Right.
Cabaret Caterer, but the other one was Street Chef.
Yep.
And I mean, I felt like I was just like, hey, how can I end my turn? Because I've seen how my deck plays, but I've never played or against that deck, and I got more joy watching how his deck operated and kind of interacting with him than for me it was just like, yeah, land. I'm gonna do this, pass. Let me get back to the enjoyment of watching something new and exciting.
Absolutely. In that same note, it almost kind of like when I'm playing with, my friends or if I'm playing with strangers and I have, Erica, she's playing. If I'm not going to win, but she is, that's something that I can also find, a ton of joy in because it's like seeing somebody who is new to the game, like having those pop off plays and taking home the dub is like, yeah, like, they're going to be hyped about it. They're going to want to like talk about the game and remember all the, cool little interactions that happened. And not to say that I'm like letting like or king making by like, but it's just an alternative win con if you can take joy in everybody having fun. Like it is a successful game night if you all come out of it with a smile on your face. If you all are sad and everybody hates you and they never want to invite you over again, even if you won, that's
Mhm.
a pretty hollow victory.
Yeah, I think it comes down to like, do you want to have joy at the table and you want to leave with everybody taking joy with them home? Um,
Right.
and for me, some of my fondest memories of Magic games and some of the stuff that have stuck with me as far as like crazy, incredible plays are things that happened to me, not things that I personally did.
Hmm.
So, when somebody has a crazy, amazing turn or they win the game, hey, celebrate that with them. Because at the same time, and you win the game, that person that's your friend or even a stranger you just met, they're gonna also, hopefully, they're also gonna celebrate your victory with you and tell you how awesome it was that, hey, you pulled off this cool combo. I can't believe you copied my Grand Arbiter. That was insane. I've never seen somebody chain those cards together like that.
Right. At least they'll say that to your face. What they say after, you guys aren't in the same room is a
Of
completely different
course,
story. But it's the
I will.
post-game conversation that matters.
So I will say, on that note, so your girlfriend Erica, she plays a Dahada deck. That's I think it started as a precon, if I'm not
Oh
incorrect,
yeah.
and but now it's like pretty heavily invested.
It's yeah, it's pretty it's up there. It's a reanimator deck and it may have started as a precon, but it can certainly handle its own.
So so my wife, who obviously plays in our pod as well, my wife Sharon. So she, I guess, went on I think either YouTube or a podcast or something, and looked up like 20 most powerful commanders for the sole purpose of trying to find a commander that's active, or that basically find a commander that's active ability was to shut off planeswalker triggers.
Okay.
I don't know if she was fully successful. Now I will tell you, she started sending me a list of commanders she wanted to build, like, that I'm a little concerned about us running into, but that, I think that's part of the fun too, which is okay. I know that Cole has the Scarab God, and he burned me one too many times with it. I can't wait to see him next Friday when I've come up and crafted the perfect counter to the Scarab God.
You're talking about a spite deck. It sounds like you're talking about a spite deck.
I think it's good to have a spite deck in a friend group. Now I'm not going to an LGS like, man, I just got paired up with, Joe nobody that I've never met, and now I've crafted this whole deck to show up and find out that he didn't come this week.
And then you wasted, your money on a deck that's only fun at making one person sad.
You made
Um,
your collector oof deck to try and stop his artifact build, and he's not here. And you're like, everybody else is just landfall. What is this garbage?
what are these rampant growths and cultivates? Somebody play a Soul Ring.
Turn it off, I tell you, turn it off. But yeah, no. So I think now's a good point. I should warn you that Sharon has sent me Omnath, the 4-color one,
Okay.
Sin triplets,
Oh, nice.
Chulane,
Okay.
and she, at least as of us hitting record on this, she was sitting in the dining room with her Gissa and Geralf precon, and she has a Wilhelt precon that she didn't really care much for Wilhelt, even though objectively he is a stronger one. She doesn't like it, but she's stripping that down for parts to try and make a super zombie precon.
Oh, I'm excited to see this. This sounds like a well, and just to be clear, I do think that each of those commanders that you mentioned are, can be fun and
Mhm.
can be oppressive. But the Sin triplets, somebody take the hit off on Sin triplets. And I think that is a really cool card that gets a seriously bad rep. Yes, it facilitates somebody else not being able to play the game, but also, man, is that fun to play somebody else's deck right out of their hand.
You know what it is? I think a lot of these commanders get like a bad rap, and then when you actually play them, you're like, it wasn't that bad.
And some of them do get a pretty bad rep, and it's absolutely worthwhile. Like I'm just also got to jump on the Toxrill hate train. That is a
Mhm.
deck that it is an uncomfortable experience in any means. I'm sure playing it, but definitely playing against it.
Yeah, I actually had, I wouldn't say a debate, but somebody had put this up on Twitter today, and I was kind of responding to it. And I want your opinion on it because it's a commander you have, which is Marin of Clan Neltoth.
Sure.
So their stance was that Marin is a kill on sight commander, because it could go out of control. Now, my opinion on this was that Marin for me fell into like the Yuriko the bucket, which is Marin is not the problem, the support pieces are the problem.
Well, I would say, like, yeah, back in the day when experience counters first came out, Marin was a huge bogeyman of the format, because like
Mhm.
anybody who's played against it and who has had Spore Frog looped, several hundred
Yeah.
times,
Or
it's a
or
feels bad scenario. Marin, if she accumulates the experience counters, it can be a great grind deck. Like I'm down to get into that mid to late game, to that late game, because I'm constantly bringing back my threats and seeing if you can deal with them over and over and again. Spoiler alert, you can't. Uh, but I would say that Marin is kind of a kill on sight commander, because if you've played against it enough, it's like you don't really want it to get any amount of experience counters.
Mhm.
But with the extent of some of the stuff that's come out today, sometimes the urgency of me being able to loop a Sakura Tribe Elder is like, maybe you don't need to focus all your hate on me. Like, read the situation and see if there's another deck that's like going to pop off and going to combo off. Like, I'm gonna grind it out. But if you waste all your resources on stopping me, can you stop Cory from popping off with his, and Hello deck when he uses,
Right.
take extra turn spell and gets, several extra turns. Not that you do that, but just an example.
Yeah, but and that's why I think it too. You have to assess the. For me, that's why I was saying you kind of have to assess the support pieces because yeah, if you're bringing like Sakura Tribe Elder out over and over again, yes, that will lead to something at some point, but it might not be a threat right on the spot. Now, if you've gotten to the point where you're doing Spore Frog or Fleshbag Marauder or Ravenous Chupacabra loops or something like that, yeah, now you've become the problem, and at that point, maybe I can't stop you, you know?
But it takes a little while to get to that point. And if you're having like problems with Spore Frog, you just gotta, you gotta exile it from the graveyard. Put a little bit of graveyard hate in there, and Marin is, not
every
nearly as scary. I consider her good, fair magic.
every black deck I run, Bajuka Bog, right in there.
It's a free slot if you're playing up against any sort of, graveyard decks.
Yeah, now maybe 90% of the games you don't need it, but the 10% you do, it's nice to have.
Oh my gosh, I'm as a huge, graveyard player, I can't express enough how devastating it is to build up your sweet, sweet graveyard and just be digging through and looking at all the fun things you get to play with, and then somebody slams down a bog, and you don't even have to ask. You just turn your graveyard sideways because they're not doing, Jimmy with his cultivate. They're not doing, you with
Hmm.
your two spells. They're typically picking the guy who has a full graveyard.
Yeah, like, you keep recurring things. Not anymore.
Even if you don't have like ways to recur stuff out of your graveyard, having a large graveyard, you're likely to get Bajuka bogged by people who feel like they don't
Yeah,
have better options. Like if somebody
and it's
else's graveyard is two cards, it's gonna be you.
yeah, that's true. Like I was gonna say, especially if you're in black, but I think yeah, you're right. If everybody was, let's say, you're all running, I don't know, mono red or something, where you're not really recurring. If you've got a 20 card graveyard and everybody else has like a 2 or 3 card, listen, you're the one who's losing it.
Well, hey, and I will say with red, I'm underworld breaching. I'm casting that ignite the future from the graveyard for the flashback cost. There's enough in every color that you kind of have to be like, are you going to be recurring that? Like, are you going to noxious survival that to your, top of your
Yeah,
deck? Are you,
Bollockhead recovery. Yeah, there's
right?
there's something out in everything.
But typically, if
Well,
you play the same decks, you kind of know. I'm like, I don't think you have a way to get that back.
I think that about wraps it up, you guys. So before we get into question of the week and card of the week, closing thoughts, Cole.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about, at the end of the day, it's all about catering your play experience to be the most fun for you and your friends. So if you're having a fun time and your friends aren't having a fun time, you just need to sit down and say, hey, how can I, adjust this? Or how can we adjust this if it's like you putting some stronger stuff into your deck, or maybe I have some stuff in my collection that I can, give out to you to bring up your deck from being an unedited precon to being just a little bit smoother. And like that doesn't mean go out and encourage your friends to spend money on cardboard, but you can say like, hey, if you want to proxy out some stuff and just have a good time, so that I don't have to either play down or let my decks collect
Mhm.
collect dust. that's the key. Is just like everybody communicating and making sure that you're sitting down for a shared experience, not like a solitaire experience that's gonna play out the same way every time.
I couldn't have really put it better than myself. I 100% agree. I think at the end of the day, I mean, the gathering is literally part of the name of the game, and also it's a game. So, make sure that you're optimizing everything, not only or not necessarily in power, but in fun to the group. Because if you don't have a fun play experience, you might not get another play experience.
Mm.
So definitely, talk to your play group, make sure everybody's on the same page. If you guys all want to go as cranked up to 11 high powered as you want, then that's great. Just make it a group decision. If you want to play nothing but pure jank, make it a group decision. Just make sure everybody's on the same page and everybody kind of knows what they're signing up for. Um, and I think we covered it enough, but fun doesn't mean no power, and power doesn't mean no fun. It's just finding that right balance for you and your friends.
Absolutely.
But moving on, we're going to do question of the week, card of the week, and then we're going to be ramping up here. So, question of the week. Uh, this one it was asked a couple weeks ago. So, thank you for your patience. First off, I knew we'd get to it. Will asks on Twitter, and this was a good question for you because you're definitely a more rules versed player than I am. Will would like to know: can you explain infect versus toxic versus poisonous as it applies to permanents and creatures, and how those rules apply to attacking creatures specifically? Then, as I follow up on that, would you ever consider building a deck, if you haven't, from the infect, toxic, poisonous kind of sub theme?
Yeah, so to answer that first question, in fact, toxic and poisonous are all similar abilities, but they have a
Mm-hmm.
couple of key differences. Infect replaces damage, and you're not actually dealing damage when you attack with a creature with infect. You're instead either putting neg 1 counters on creatures that block it, or you're giving a player poison counters. And so this is actually a static ability because the poison counters are placed onto the player as soon as quote damage unquote is done. Um, Now, when we're looking at toxic, which is a much newer mechanic that came out recently with the
March ish.
Phyrexia, all will be
Mm-hmm.
one. Um, that is a damage effect where somebody's dealing damage and then the toxic number is applied directly to the player.
Mm-hmm.
uh, that it's different because you get to deal the damage and add the poison counters, whereas infect is just adding poison counters. um, Now poisonous is an old school it was the future sight
much,
rendition of
much
this
older.
effect. Yes, and it is a similar effect to Toxic in that you add the counters after dealing damage. But this is a triggered ability where Toxic and Infect are static abilities. Um, Poisonous, you deal the damage, and then the poisonous trigger goes on the stack. So what's kind of cool about this is that you can put poisonous, and toxic together. You can't put poisonous and infect together because you're never going to be dealing any damage as soon as your creature has infect. But
Yeah,
with a
there's nothing to
card
convert.
there's a card called Snake Cult Initiation, which is an aura that enchants a creature and gives it poisonous 3. And using that on a creature with toxic, that would be pretty dubious. You'd have to be pretty cool to make a play like that. Um, Now, in terms of how the rules apply to attacking creatures, you're attacking with a creature with infect. I mean, that's basically the attack isn't as relevant as the
The
block, as the
blocking. Hmm.
damage. Yeah. So a lot of infect is going to give those neg 1 counters, where toxic and poisonous are not going to do anything to creatures that block that creature.
Hmm.
Um, Now, would I ever build a deck from them? My Atraxa deck that I mentioned earlier, it had a decent amount of time that it was played as an infect deck, and so I have played an infect deck, and it's a little slow. I think infect is a lot, less scary than people give it credit for. But if I
Hmm.
were to build one now, I would want to do something kind of unique. I know there is that Fen the Fangbearer, but I'm a fan of kind of like crazier in combat effects. So I would play something like Octavia the Living Thesis, which is a blue blue and 8 for a legendary elemental octopus. It costs 8 less as long as you have 8 instant or sorcery cards in your graveyard or more. It has Ward 8, and whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, target creature has base power and toughness 8/8 until end of turn. So I want to play an infect deck where I'm slow. I'm putting out my little, 2/2, my little 2/1 infectors in mono
Hmm.
blue, and when they're unblocked, which they often are because of an inherent ability, casting something like a brainstorm or a pongify and turning that
Hmm.
creature from a 2/1 into an 8/8, making any creature a two-shot kill with infect is an alpha dog maneuver.
Yeah, I agree. So, I think the wording is what throws people off. You kind of explain the different abilities because they're named very similar. So yeah, in fact is I swing a 2/2 and it deals two neg 1 counters as damage, but no actual damage. Toxic is I swing a 2/2 with toxic 1 or whatever. It's going to deal 2 life and a poison counter. Um, and then poisonous is I swing a 2/2 and when it connects, instead of doing 2 damage, it converts those into 2 poison counters, basically.
Well, on that last one on poisonous, it's when they deal, you still deal the damage. It's very similar to
Mhm.
toxic. It's just that it's a triggered ability versus a static ability. So
Gotcha.
it goes on the stack and can be, it could be stifled.
Let's be more realistic though. Poisonous on the storm scale of will we ever see it again? Not very likely. I think toxic is probably the way they push it forward. Toxic and more corrupted abilities.
Absolutely. Corrupted being if a player has three or more, poison counters, they are considered corrupted, and it will
Hmm.
extend the effects of a lot of cards, which is similar back in the day. There were cards that cared if a player was poisoned. But I agree with you that I think toxic is probably the future direction that they'll take Infect, even though I
Hmm.
don't think it's so super strong. It is, considered an unfun play style by a lot of like newer players, and so I don't think Wizards of the Coast will encourage that by making it much stronger.
Yeah, no, I think Infect itself is probably well, it's a little different situational, but as a whole, is probably more um powerful in the sense that if you had like a 4/4 or a 5/5 with toxic, or I'm sorry, with infect, you're dealing a larger chunk as opposed to like a static toxic one. Like you could pump an infect creature.
And you can add multiple versions of toxic to a creature, and it will
Mhm.
just increase the toxic amount. But yeah, like you said, having a 10/10 with infect versus a 10/10 with toxic 1 makes for a very different combat.
Yeah. Now where would you stand? We talked about a different ability earlier, kind of off stream. Um, where would you stand on this, including Wither? Because Wither doesn't deal with the player. So Wither for you guys is when it deals damage, it converts that damage into -1/-1 counters on a creature.
I personally really like that effect. It's like the second half of Infect, but
Mhm.
you can still deal damage to a player. And there's some really strong cards with it. Wither. One of them that has been played against me many times is the Kolrath Knight.
Mhm.
It's 3 and 2, two hybrid red-black mana for flying and Wither, and creatures your opponents control with counters on them can't attack or block. It
Mm.
has Wither itself, so it's able to put neg 1 counters on things, but that's any counter. So if you're playing a +1/+1 counter deck or any sort of counter synergies, this card comes down and makes it extremely difficult to have any sort of effects in combat. Uh, it makes you think a lot more about your, oh well, sure, of course I'll just block your 2/2 with my commander, because those neg 1 counters don't go away. So
Mhm.
you got to think about combat a little bit more, which I do think is a fun mechanic.
So yeah, I think hopefully that answers your question, but yeah, I think Toxic's probably the one you're going to see kind of pushed more in the future. Poisonous, I would venture to say it's probably written off at this point. Infect, maybe situational. We'll see it again, but I think Toxic is probably going to be like 95%
It's worth
what we're going
stating
to see.
that I believe the Atali Primal Conqueror, the
Oh,
new Atali, he
is
has Infect.
Infect. Yeah,
Hmm.
on the reverse side.
Right, right.
And then as far as if I would build a deck from them, maybe one day. You mentioned Finn the Fangbearer, which is like a Death Touch turned into Infect.
Right.
Um, I've considered that before, but again, I don't have any mono green decks, so maybe that'll be my mono green deck, but not today, I don't think.
Uh-huh.
That's question of the week. If you guys have a question of the week you'd like to have myself or Cole or Dylan or whoever answer, go ahead and leave it down in the comments. Shoot me a message, DMs, whatever you want to do, and we'll try and get those answered for you. But that's question of the week. Cole, you have been the man in charge of card of the week this week. So what is our card of the week?
Well, the card of the week this week, that's a little drum roll for you, is
Kura Tribuilder.
City on Fire. City on Fire is from March of the Machines. It's an 8-drop enchantment that with Convoke, meaning that your
Mhm.
creatures can help cast that spell by paying 1 colorless mana or 1 mana of their color by tapping. And the effect on it reads, if a source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals triple that damage instead. Now, I wanted to pick a newer card, and this card some people might not say is too new because it did come out a couple sets ago, but to me it's
Mhm.
at a point where I've had the chance to play it enough times to kind of have a better understanding of it. It's a card that when I first saw, I didn't think it was that crazy, but I've slotted it into a couple decks, and every time I play it, it is a utterly game
Mhm.
changing, extremely fun effect that I just want more of. I've had some really fun plays with the Locust God, being able to not only tap his 1/1, insects for mana to cast City on Fire, but to be able to turn those 1/1s into 3/1s is a pretty strong ability. You'd be
Mhm.
surprised at how many little things, like even a simple lightning bolt, now deals 9 damage to any target. That's a good deal.
Mhm.
Uh, I also have to say that it is a double-edged sword because permanents that you control that would deal damage to you deal triple damage
Mhm.
instead as well. So you have to be a little bit careful, but that having that extra complexity of not just being able to, abuse it makes it a very fun card to play in a multiplayer format.
Yeah, I am actually very high on this card as well. Actually, yesterday, as of us recording yesterday, as of you listening to this about a week ago, um, I was not on as a guest, but I was in chat on another creator's Twitch stream, and they were building a deck and kind of taking input from the comment section. And that was a card I recommended. And the deck they were building was Agar, the Freezing Flame, which
Oh,
is a
sure.
one blue red, and it's whatever giant wizard or spell deals excess damage to a creature, you draw a card. So I was like, hey, triple the damage, why not?
I think it's a great card, and it's one that you might see and think, how am I ever going to fit this in my deck? It costs 8 mana. But the amount of times you're able to squeeze this out on, an earlier turn,
Mhm.
it always pays itself off without
Yeah,
fail.
it is definitely a card that when you look at the mana, yeah, you might be put off a little bit by it. And when you read it, I feel like sometimes, not just with Magic, but like TCGs in general, people tend to correlate a lot of text with card power, and this is not a lot of text. But sometimes it's also the opposite, where the most simple effect is a very powerful effect, and they don't need to explain it in 3 paragraphs.
Exactly. Sometimes dealing triple damage is good.
Yeah. um, yeah, I agree. Great card of the week. 10 out of 10, in my opinion. Especially if you find the right build for it. But that goes ahead and wraps up this week's episode. Uh, Cole, if the people want to follow you or find you, where can they reach out to you at?
Yeah, well, I'm on Instagram as loveandmana.mtg, and all of our other, socials are Love and Mana MTG or some variation of that. It's all on the Instagram. So you give me a follow and we can talk.
Have you unraveled the threads yet? You're on threads, yeah?
We did make threads. So
Yeah, so if you want to reach out to Cole or his girlfriend, who I don't know why, but she's also on there if you want to talk
we
to her.
share the Instagram. It's our brand.
It's loveandmana.mtg or just Love and Mana MTG.
It will vary on a couple of different social medias depending on the availability of our username, but it's a variation of Love and Mana MTG on every platform.
Okay, so if you enjoyed listening to Cole, go ahead and give him a follow, or if you have questions for him, or you dislike his hot takes on poisonous versus infect. I mean, I don't know what would be hot about him because it was just the rules, but
I'll
you
block
know,
you. I will. Any dissent, and I'll just block you.
if you want to tell him how you have the most fun Toxrill deck in existence, go ahead and send that over to him. You can follow me at Sleevecard on all those platforms as well: Instagram, Threads, Twitter, YouTube, whatever. It's a very unique name. I don't have to find variations for it. Or you can follow the podcast at ErCastPod, or you can reach out to us at contact.urcast@gmail.com. But thank you for making it to the end of the episode. Have yourselves a magical Friday, and we will see you next week.
Later.